Vernice Jones.
Dominic Longo,
Hello, hello.
how are you?
Great. Lovely to have you with me
Good.
today. Um, you're part of the Flourishing Gaze team. You are a master coach, an expert in adult human development, and you have an MBA. I mean, I don't know, you've done so many things in your.
It's so funny. Yeah, it's funny to hear those labels.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but it's good to be here.
Good to have you. And we're here to have a conversation about meaning making, perspective shifting, some aspects of adult human development that I know you're especially interested in. And of course, part of this is to get to know you and how your own uh, journey of learning and working with clients in these areas have also impacted you personally.
hmm
So, where would you like to start us off?
Good question. Thank you. Yeah, so I think meaning making is a beautiful place to start. Um, and I love this idea of meaning making because we all think that well, maybe not all of us think, but it's this nice idea that the experience that we're having is the actual experience. Like the perspective that we have is the actual world around us. When in fact, our meaning making is the facts or experience plus a lot of things overlaid on top of us, on top of it. There's assumptions and conclusions that we make, our belief systems, all the associations we make, the somatic experiences, and all of those things create some experience, our behavior of the world, our behavioral responses, and our sort of decision context. And from there, we're off. Um, but what all of that implies is that what we believe to be true may not actually be true for someone else and may not be true at all. Um, and what we know about other people is that they're not just a bunch of skills and interests put together, but that they also are a sense-making system in and of themselves, which is really interesting during this time when you have a bunch of people, in my case, cooped up in a house, who just are seeing the world and experiencing the world in completely different ways. So really helpful to know in the context of your business meeting, not just to meet someone else in terms of where your joint interests are, but really to know that this is a whole operating system that is separate and works differently from yours.
What you're really pointing to is how we construct our own reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, we're impacted by reality and then we construct it in
Yeah,
kind.
yeah, and we truly experience a different reality, each of us.
True. Yeah, correct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And how did you get into this yourself? Like, it's clear that you care about this and you know a lot about this. Can you just tell a little bit about your own journey into this? And yeah.
Yeah. So I would say, I have thought about this sort of topic for a long time without really knowing what it was. I think, particularly, I went to China for the first time in grad school at a time when I was sort of struggling with what my own identity felt like, what it looked like, what it in fact was. And that was a huge perspective sort of shift for me. And that I think was the first time that I really started to, and I'd traveled before, but that was the first time that I really understood that there was a whole different meaning making system going on in other people than happening within me.
Hmm. And I know that how important China has been to you in your journey, eventually really learning Chinese to a high level and bringing your leadership development work there. Um, but yeah, you're bringing up this sense of sort of your own sense of self, your own identity as an African American woman, uh, married with children, and experiencing this very different other culture. How can you just tell us a little bit more? How did experiencing China when you were a grad student begin to, I don't know, shift your own constructed reality?
Yeah, it's a good question. Um, Well, it was, I think the first the first taste of that meaning making difference was when actually just before I started grad school, and I read this book called Spring Moon by Betty Ballard. And I had been reading, this is a book, a historical novel, generations of Chinese women, and in China the past few generations have a very different historical context
Like one
and
from the other.
experience of from one from the other, very different. Similar to, for me, the African American community, the generational context for the last 3 or 4 generations, totally different. So anyway, so I'd been reading a bunch of African American books, multi-generational novels, and this book struck me in the exact same way.
Mm.
And it's really beautiful and scary and opened up a whole different sort of context of curiosity for me. So when I went to graduate school and had the opportunity to do, a semester abroad, I said, I want to go to China. So I really want to explore that it stayed with me. And so I did just that. And there was a very deep connection that I had there, and felt very separate at the same time.
Mm.
But unlike sort of the American context of feeling, very American, very at home, but also feeling separated, I didn't have this sort of American obsession about race context. So there's a way that I could work that out there that I couldn't work it out here. And because I tend to be a very, very intimate in nature, some of the relationships that I had developed there had such a deep sense of intimacy because we were going across this bridge, this chasm of ethnicity. Um, and for some people, like people were scared by looking at me or shocked by looking at me, and all of those things, I had to hold them both. So that was really, I would say, a beautiful and deepening experience. And every time I went, that sort of experience went a little bit deeper, like my nuance, my complexity that I experienced just expanded a little bit more. And so many people have heard me say the way I think about my own growth in terms of adult development, I often see through the lens of my relationship with China.
Yeah, I'm sort of making up that when you showed up there, as much as you had begun to read and learn about China, there was so much you didn't know, and like you encounter these humans, and it's not quite a blank slate, but there's just like not tons in the container as you experience these people, and likewise
Mm-hmm.
they're what they hold about you, seeing you as a Black woman, maybe not knowing that you're an African American woman at first. They're like, they don't see too many folks who look like you, so they
Yeah.
also have sort of a certain, not again, not a blankness, but certainly not the same kind of preconceptions and cultural conditioning that that I, as a fellow American, with a much lighter skin and a European background, like that I just took in with my mother's milk, so to speak, and has been just part, like, of course that's there. So you're each in China, you and whoever your new friends, or you're kind of constructing a sense of identity, like mutually,
Mm.
through that. And going back to the meaning making, like that, the space for that seems to have been much more open for you there.
Yeah, for sure. And I also want to just make a distinction between the first time I went and the second time I went, and you know what I'm saying? Each time I had a very different
Yeah.
experience, but it was sort of like it's like I would say any romantic relationship, because
Oh.
in the beginning it really was this beautiful romance that I was having. It initially in my mind with China as a whole context. Of course, I met with lots of people with lots of different backgrounds, but China as a context, stepping into it, was very different for me. And so my initial relationships was in the context of that romance. And so there was a sort of um, there was a passion about it, and there was sort of like a breaking of my heart when some people were like, what? Like, what is that? And now there's a much more mature sort of relationship that I'm having with China. Sort of my space is when I go to China, I don't have husband, I don't have kids. There's lots of space. There's lots of creativity. I tend to do work on projects where lots of passions come together. And so it represents something very different for me. And it's based on this foundation of passion and like a place where I broke open
Mm.
from innocence.
Yeah. Um, throughout our friendship over these last five years, 6 years already, I don't know. Um, my experience as a gay man, your experience as an African American woman, has been something that we've shared and talked about, and certain points of similarity. And there, I'm sort of grasping about a little bit of, like, in my own experience or the experience of other gay men that I know, like, what's the place that we can go
Mm,
and have this sort of um, fresh context,
mm-hmm,
in which to show up without maybe some of our baggage, but also other parts of our identity that we're very happy to have.
mm-hmm,
Which
mm-hmm,
when you're talking about your family, I know how devoted you are to your beautiful family, and yet being away from them, you're able to sort of reach into other parts of yourself. Um, again, I'm kind of like looking into the LGBTQ experience, because in a way, like, either we're maybe passing as straight, or firmly in the closet, or maybe among our tribe, at a pride parade like you and I went to together with your son once. Um, what is that place? What are other places that people can go to find, I don't know, this kind of beautiful open field for fresh meaning making and perspective shifting?
yeah, that's a great question. And so sometimes I feel like, um, and this may sound strange, but it feels sort of like an elder of the marginalized communities as an African American woman, right?
Yes, yes.
Um, so there's a lot that I get about um, being marginalized and all of the structures that African Americans have put in place to keep us safe and to keep us flourishing, as you say.
Mm.
So there's something really interesting about gay men, like queer women. When you first come out, like you never, not everyone, but that whole like dimension of marginalization is entirely new. And so what is that like? The whole idea of the importance of tribe, the whole importance of safety, the importance of like playing around with your identity in a context where, you know, it's not so well accepted, and even knowing for yourself what it means outside of the context. That whole work is entirely new. And so for a lot of people, not everyone, it comes later in life.
Yeah, that's right.
And so there's something that comes very natural to you. In fact, is sort of a generational memory embedded in my DNA about, for example, when to click in. So this is related to adult development, because over time you experience qualitatively different understandings, experience, and even reach about being able to experience, see, understand, interpret nuances and complexity. So very early on in our adult development, we're in this place of survival. I win, you win, or I don't care. So this sort of survival context, I really get, and we all can sort of click. We all have access to these old parts of ourselves. And so I'm completely comfortable sort of shifting into that survival mode. And particularly where you're a marginalized community, this next stage, which is really about seeing yourself primarily through this tribe, this place of tribe, and that sort of being it. There's sort of a righteousness about it. A beautiful way to look at that in terms of identity is, when we feel unsafe, in these times, it's very easy to imagine that, but also feeling unsafe in our identity.
Mhm.
And it doesn't just have to be identity. Like tribe can be a place that we go, and maybe the LGBTQ place is one of those places for you, and maybe there are other places as well. That's a place where you can go for safety, where you don't stand out, where you're not crazy, where you're not out there. On some level, there's just a settling in, and it's just fine. And there are other communities where you feel that as well. You may feel that as well. And so those are sort of initial stages where I think, particularly for marginalized communities, this is really important. The next stage is around, authoring your life, including honoring, celebrating, and in spite of all of the things that you used to define yourself in the past. And that includes community, but that also includes stepping out of the community sometimes and figuring out what is me beyond that. And sometimes, which I really love, sort of being within community, whatever community is your primary community, can sort of be, it can sometimes make you feel like you're in a box in lots of ways, but in some ways it can be like the door that you open to have a broader experience. In the same way, so I've been doing a lot of meditation over the last few years, in the same way, sort of breath can be an open door to your larger experience around meditation and groundedness. And so that's part of my perspective, and that's where I see that there's a lot of adjacency and complementary experience around being African American woman, being clear, of course, there's lots of intersectionality.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Thank you. And as you know, I've been thinking about these stages in terms of particularly LGBTQ experience, and what you're saying about the coming out moment and the kind of new experience of marginalization that comes there is very real. And let's, in some cases, and that coming out moment and finding tribe are in some ways they're together. I mean, in a way, it is a coming out to show up at a gay bar in a certain way, even if you're saying, oh, no,
Absolutely. Oh,
it is a coming
absolutely.
out to have gay friends. It, of course, is coming out to show up on Grindr, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this term queer superpowers is one that you've probably heard me use before, and is one that I think about a lot with Flourishing Gays. This is maybe something to go into deeper some other time, but I've been thinking about how at each developmental stage, like the three that you just mentioned, which Bob Keegan calls self-sovereign, and then socialized mind, and then self-authoring, there are particular queer superpowers that are available, not necessary, but that are available, and that many of us kind of develop in that stage.
Mm.
And in the self-sovereign, when it's like surviving, that's like, I think of the theme song being like, I'm a survivor, as like an anthem for that stage.
Yeah.
The superpower that is possible for us as LGBTQ folks is passing.
Mm-hmm.
Which it's of course not available for you in terms of showing up as an African American, out of the boom, you're there, you are. And yet for us, like, learning to fit in a way that's a kind of a false identity, or that's a false conscious, depending on our own sense of self-awareness. And of course the psychosexual development is different for different folks, but for many, it's like they knew they were a gay kid from like early, and
Mm-hmm.
and it's like, I got to be safe and pretend that I'm someone else, or that I'm just like the other boys.
Mm-hmm.
And that skill, it's like this chameleon like
Mm-hmm.
passing availability, Well, that's a valuable skill. You know, you have these, you
Oh
know,
yeah, sure.
superheroes with these sort of invisible, you know,
Mhm.
cloak or
Mhm.
whatever.
Mhm.
Um, you know, I've done some other thinking about the other superpowers that are
Mhm.
available, but
Mhm. Mhm.
you're kind of focusing on that transition from that.
No, absolutely. Yeah, and so all of us have explored passing in our own way. I mean, you certainly, there are lots of African Americans who, as you try to fit in your community and your group of friends, there's lots of passing, but I feel like everyone can relate to an experience of trying to fit in
Yes.
for the sake of less pain, for the sake of more acceptance, for the sake of our own success, for the sake of, maybe there's a larger goal or interest you have in mind. So I mean, that is a universal truth that
Makes
we
sense.
all, can really experience, have a felt sense of together.
Yes.
Um, and, as we sort of touch on like what it means to really be me, you've got to sort of explore the edges. So, so part of like I'm a survivor, part of it, there's the passing piece. And the part of it is, superpowers, I'm going to be super gay. You know what I mean? In this
Yeah.
moment, I'm going to be doubly black. In this
Yeah.
moment, I'm going to really explore with my identity and turn the volume up to 10,
Yeah.
12, and see
Yeah.
what that feels like. I mean, that's part of the experience too. When
Yes.
we play with the edges of our identity, that
Yes.
helps us understand where is our comfort zone to
Yeah.
step outside of it.
The phrase fagging out comes to mind. Or
Great.
clean it up, you know,
Yeah,
like I do
yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah, I'm thinking Black Power, I'm
Yeah.
thinking, there are all kinds of things. And so that's what I sort of mean. That was a whole movement
Yeah.
in the Black community. That's part of our like cultural memory
Yes. Yes.
that goes deep, that
Yeah.
people talk about, they learn about. I mean, there's, that is a really important part of your memory and identity and
Yeah.
social consciousness as a part of a clearly marginalized group.
Yeah. And when you talk about passing, I think of all of the skincare products that are about lightning,
Yeah,
or
yeah, yeah.
you know, lessons to sort of not speak Black English. And
Well, so I think that that's more like I feel like as an African American experience, it's more of the language piece,
okay,
you
yeah,
know, um, and you go back into community, you talk the way you want to talk. Some people, um, use whatever language they want out in the world, but a lot of people with you will sort of use language they feel you're comfortable with. So I'm just thinking of a family, a Caucasian family that adopted a Black child and wrote a letter to the teachers about how not to speak to my child. So people have started,
like not
fist
use Black English
bumping
with
and
them.
not use Black English
Wow.
with it. So there's a whole, without going down the rabbit hole there,
Yeah.
um, there's a lot to playing on the edges of identity
Yeah.
and sort of seeing identity as something that we go through. And it's part of our just natural development. It's part of our landscape. It's part of what we will touch as we, develop and grow. And so there's no way not to look at it.
Yes.
We
And
must look at it.
you know, you and I in our friendship have in some ways been companions, as
Mm-hmm.
we have uh, in this journey of adult development, partly because we're professionally interested in it, and partly just because of this conversation about identity. And what I know is that identity doesn't go away as we move on. Like, you and I are not in the survivor mode as a center of gravity in our lives anymore. That's, you know, years back. And yet figuring out, well, how do I show up as a man today? How do I show up as a LGBTQ person? How do I show up as an American?
Mm.
How do I, in my case, how do I show up as a Catholic? Like,
Mm-hmm.
these are questions that were pressing for me as a 15-year-old, as a 25-year-old, as a 35-year-old, and now as a 45-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
My relationship to those questions is different in each
Mm-hmm.
of those moments, and yet they're always somehow pressing, if not, okay, maybe they're not problematic in ways that they were when I was just becoming a man or coming out. Those were maybe a centerpiece, but they're still pressing questions.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a question that's often used in the adult development community. How could I be wrong?
Yes, yes.
Right? And so I think that this question just is as important when we think of our identity. And that is, when I think of myself, my biggest self, the fullness of myself, like, what am I not noticing? How could I be wrong to think that the fullest expression of Vernice is what I think of her in this moment?
Hmm. How could I be wrong, like about you as my friend,
No,
or
well,
about you, or about myself?
initially about me on my own.
Okay, got
I
it.
think of the fullness of Vernice and who my identity is, where
Yes,
I stand, what is meaningful to me, all, my full expression. So
yes,
when I step into myself and I feel full, I feel grounded, and I think, okay, who is this person, Vernice Jones, right? How might I be wrong there?
yeah.
Right? So I may think I am a Black woman, African American woman. Um, Stop.
Hmm.
Is that true? I am an African American, wise, fierce woman.
Yes, you are.
Is that true?
Hmm.
Like, what? Where is there more?
Yes. Yeah,
What am I denying?
these
What do
labels
I need to say? Yeah.
that I start introduced. It's like, okay, I like list your, some of your professional qualifications because this is pretty
Right.
professional, and you're like, oh wow, those labels, like, yes,
Right.
how could that be wrong?
Right. Right. And so the more we look at our list, the things that we typically refer to when we think of ourselves, whether it's the label in the way that we describe ourselves, African American, fierce, wise, whatever those things are, even when we look up at values, right? We can look at our list and keep checking. We could look at our purpose and keep checking.
Yes,
That still might not be true in this moment.
yeah,
And so there is something around like looking within as a community and as an individual and say, what is manifesting for me in this moment? And how can I step into that? And that's true for the community. That's true for the LGBTQ plus community. It's also true for the African American
yeah.
community, all kinds of communities where we step into, as a
And,
community, what is manifesting now, not what manifested 5, 10,
yes,
15 years ago.
yes.
What's manifesting now, and how does my voice articulate that thing that is manifesting now?
I think where we've come in this conversation is really flourishing, like
Mm-hmm.
this continual asking, okay, how could I be wrong about my image of my greatest self, my biggest self, my most expansive, grounded, beautiful self at my best? And as we challenge that, and as we, let's say, kind of soften the edges of our self-definition to allow the manifesting of now, of who I am now,
Mm-hmm.
that process is what makes space for flourishing.
Correct. And even so, I think a great example of this is you,
Hmm.
right? So you are looking within and without. And what is manifesting now that my voice and my effort can step into in this moment? And so this whole concept and offering a flourishing gaze was what you saw as a need in the moment and what you stepped into. And so that's a system that is, made available, and is also, it's a context that you're also creating, that you're constantly creating and recreating with others. And even as that system is evolving, you're evolving within it,
I am, of course.
as a creator, but also as a person that's impacted by the system.
Yeah.
So that's sort of a part of of the constructed reality, but also sort of an understanding of how the identity piece can really step into it. There's something for you that you want to, I don't want to say just an offering, but there is something that is manifesting,
Yes.
right? That you are giving voice to, because it's not a Dominic voice. Otherwise, no one would show up. If
Yeah.
it was just Dominic, no one would show up. But because there is interest, And because, you know, the times, it's difficult, it's a difficult time, but there is a real need for this kind of work. And so you're giving your voice to it, you're stepping into it, and just seeing what's there. And things are flourishing. How about
Yeah,
that?
yeah. Thank you for that acknowledgement, and thank you for being part of that system that,
Yeah.
you know, it's like we're co-creating, and you know, like my hope is, of course, that our work in this flourishing gaze stuff together also enhances your own development, and you're growing into an ever more wise, fierce, and whatever else human that you already are. Um,
Thank you. Thank
Vernice,
you.
I'm so grateful for you as my friend, as my colleague, as you being you. Thank you for all of you and all that you bring, and for this conversation.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks, Dominic.